Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. You can also find different ways to say words incorrectly, such as host. On danielpoppy.com, my Poppy is spelled P-O-P-P-I-E for those of you. Not Y, not P-O-P-P-Y, P-O-P-P-I-E. You can find my book on there, The Ninth Hour. You can also find my serialized novel on there. Anything else I'm doing, a little bit about me. You can find my beautiful face on there as well. A little bit old, but it's still beautiful, right? I had a few things. So before I start, I just wanted to connect to everybody. I know there was someone, and I don't remember exactly because it wasn't a name. It was like more of like a podcast or a title that commented on a show on Podbean. And I do want to comment back, but I'm incapable of commenting because I don't know how to get into Podbean. I think I have a login somehow, but I can't get to my show. I can't comment on things that people have commented on before. They won't let me. So yeah, so if you're listening to this podcast and you happen to like it and you want to interact, please reach out at Instagram or Facebook. It'll take me a little bit longer on Facebook. Instagram is probably the best. I check it the most, but I do try to get back to you. Another quick thing is I've been thinking a lot about how to do this podcast, and I've been thinking a lot about how to make it better. And I've been very busy, but at the same time, I want to make this podcast something that you who listen, it's something valuable to you. It's something that you actually want to listen to. So if you are someone who writes, or if you're someone who reads, or if you're just someone who does stuff that's creative, and you have questions related to being creative, related to writing, related to reading, related to art in general, I'd love if you could send those over. If you just ever run into something. So if you're a writer and you don't know how to do something with writing, I'd love for you to send those over because I want it to be beneficial to you. And I also don't want this to just be me speaking, because I know there's quite a few people who listen to the podcast. So I want this to be something that you're actually a part of, that you actually feel some ownership in. And it doesn't feel like I'm just doing whatever I want. I want to actually do stuff that you want me to do. And then there's stuff that I want to do. And then there's other people who come in, and there's other people who also give their feedback or give information on the podcast. So yeah, so that's all. If you do have questions, I'd love to hear from you. If you have any comments, if you have anything to say about an episode, definitely say. If you disagree with me, definitely say that you disagree with me, because I'm really surprised nobody has called me out and been like, hey, you're totally wrong about this. But maybe my voice is just too annoying. So definitely reach out for anything. If you want to say I'm ugly and my ideas stink and I should never record again, I'd love to hear it, actually. I would probably laugh a little bit. All right, so we're going to get to the word of the week. Our word of the week is actually two. And this is a word that I honestly use incorrectly. Our word of the week is cynical, and I'm going to be contrasting it with skeptical. So cynical is someone who is distrustful of human nature or motives. Or there's two definitions that are essentially the same thing. So if you're someone who does not trust human behavior, nature, or human motives, then you are a cynical person. Okay, so for example, this would fit into something. Someone who gives the argument that they do not think communism would work, which I don't think it would work either, but they do not think communism would work because human nature, there's too many flaws within human nature. They're distrustful that human nature would allow it to work. Okay, and there's other reasons why you would say it wouldn't work, but that would be someone who's cynical in that case. Another definition of cynical is thinking that human nature is primarily motivated by self-interest, okay? Human nature is primarily motivated by self-interest, which would be similar to the other one. So they're not the same exact, the two definitions are not the same exact thing, but they are related, okay? So you often hear cynical used in politics a lot. So you hear that someone is cynical and what that person means. So if they say, this president is a cynical president, or this governor is a cynical governor, they are meaning that person is motivated primarily by their own self-interests And that's where the buck stops. So they're saying this person is motivated by self-interest. There might be other things woven in there that you think you see, but in the end, they're going to do what's best for them. Now, I sometimes in the past have used cynical in the place of skepticism or skeptical. Okay, and skeptical is having doubt toward a particular idea or subject or object. Okay. You're uncertain of a specific idea, right? It's usually in relation to an idea. So cynical means that you're cynical in a way means you're skeptical of human nature, or you think human nature isn't good, or you think someone is just motivated out of self-interest. Skeptical is more related to having doubt toward a specific idea, okay? And I wonder if they are related in some way. I don't really know. I'm not looking up the etymology right now, but those are two words that sound similar. They do not mean the same thing, but they have analogous meanings, to bring back an old word, okay, if that makes sense. So they have meanings that are kind of similar, but they're not the exact same meaning, and I think that we should be aware that they're not the exact same meaning. So we are going to, there's so much stuff. Not tons of stuff today. I've got tons of stuff today, but there's so much stuff on my mind, so I've actually got to sort through it. We're going to be talking about something I run into a lot with writing, and a lot of questions I run into. I have more recently been frequenting Quora, and I use it as kind of to get ideas in a lot of ways. And I've started to answer questions on it because nobody answered the people's questions. So I'm like, nobody's answering this question, so I'm gonna take a shot at this, and maybe I can answer it well. Maybe I can give them some good information. My least favorite questions are questions about how do you go about writing / publishing a book? Because honestly, you need to see it once, and after you've seen it once, then you're fine. So for those of you who want to write a book, this is what you do. You make a short outline with a specific scenes, or you can make a really long outline. After you make your outline, you do your first draft. And you write your first draft without looking back. You don't read anything you've written before. You just write it. You set aside a certain amount of time of day to write, and that's what you do. After you write it, then you go through as many edits as possible, starting with the biggest issues and going down to the smallest issues. After you've edited it, or in the middle of editing / revisions, you give it to other people to read. They give you feedback, and then you go through more revisions. At some point, if you want to work with a content editor, you work with a content editor. You go through more revisions and edits. Finally, you're doing the little tiny polishing touches, such as fixing grammatical errors, and you've written a book, and then you go on to publishing. There you go. But one thing I run into questions, and how should I phrase this? They are very specific, okay? So the questions are stuff like, how do I make a character seem realistic? Or what is the best way? What's a way to start a novel that is really grabbing to the audience, okay? Or what's another one I've run into? Another one I've run into is like, what's the best way to end a novel? Or what's the best way to describe, or how do I describe a scene? How do I describe a character? How do I do this? How do I do that? And with any type of creative field, with any creative endeavor, there is a certain amount of how when you run into it. But I think that we're actually, if you are someone who asks, how do I do this? How do I do that? I think you're asking the wrong questions, okay? Or you're at a point where you need to learn more about something. Now, if you're asking questions about, what's a way to describe a character that doesn't seem like I'm just being exposition heavy? Or here's an example. We're gonna go with, how do I create a grabbing, an addictive, we'll go with that, beginning of a book beginning. Okay? How do I create an addictive book beginning? Now, if you're asking these questions, you actually need to move beyond, how do I do something? Okay? But we're going to go through that first. We're going to go through something else before we get to that. So that's where we're going toward. We're going to get to your question. If you have questions like this, like, how do I do this? How do I do that? I'm going to get to that, but we need to go through something first. Okay. So every creative endeavor that is actually creative. Okay, strike that. Every artistic endeavor requires that you have specific knowledge and specific skills to do that artistic thing. Okay? Now, in our modern world, we've actually gotten rid of that skill set. We've gotten rid of this view that you need to have skills to be artistic. And that's not true. You do need skills to be artistic. You might need minimal skills to be artistic, but you do need some skill to be artistic. In the modern day, there's a lot of people who have minimal, very little skill. They have the smallest amount of skill, and then they think they're these profound artists, and they create stuff that is it's not attractive. It's not something people want to look at. It's not something people want to hear. It might be unique, but it doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean it's particularly artistic, right? So think of being artistic as a scale. And I think that you have to pair creativity with a skill to get to that top of the top of that scale. Someone who has that skill, they've developed that skill, they've allowed themselves to experiment with that skill to the point where they can craft something really good, right? So, for example, if you are a woodworker and you want to make a chair, when you start to woodwork, if you have the bare minimum of skills with woodworking, you are going to be making a chair that is it's a very poor example of craftsmanship, okay? And someone who sees that chair is going to be thinking, well, all you did was hammer a few pieces of wood together. There's no skill that goes into making that chair. We, for whatever reason, in the functional world, if something is required to be functional, then we understand what quality is in that thing a lot better, right? If you are making a chair and you have barely any skill in woodworking, so if I made a chair, I would probably get a few pieces of wood, I'd screw them together and be like, there's your chair. And I have a friend who actually can do woodworking. He's not the best, but he is a lot more skilled than me. He's someone who can make really nice stuff that is a high level of craftsmanship. You know, he's not the best in the world, but that takes a lot to be the best in the world. And when he makes a chair or he makes whatever, you can see that it's a higher quality. For whatever reason, we do not translate this idea over to art. We don't translate it over to other creative fields because we don't see them as practical, because we don't actually... The thing about it is that the art in your culture is actually an important thing, and it doesn't feed you, but it does inform. It either or both informs. It teaches you meaning within the culture. It teaches you like a mythology of the culture, or it shows us what our culture is like. And in our culture right now, we're seeing a lot of this art coming out, especially in visual arts. I always pick on modern art and visual art. In visual arts, we see a lot of art coming out that maybe it's very creative. Maybe it's doing something completely different. And but at the same time, that person isn't pairing it with a skill. If someone were to make a chair that was very creative, but at the same time it doesn't have skill involved, everybody's going to be like, that's the crappiest chair I've ever seen in my life. But we don't do the same thing with art. One of the reasons why we don't do it with art is because people don't actually understand the skill involved in doing something that's artistic. If someone paints something, people are like, oh, that's amazing. That's really cool. I wish I could paint like that. Or if somebody plays music, somebody's like, oh, that's really cool. I wish I could play music like that. Or if someone writes a book, or if someone name whatever creative field, does a graphic design, or I'm trying to think of other creative fields, but I can't think of it. But if you're in a creative field and you make something creative, people don't really understand the skill involved because because what you've made is more abstract. What people usually think, so if you create a chair, what people can see that chair, people can see how it's put together. People are stuck in that concrete mindset, and people understand, oh yeah, they built a chair, and I understand that it's really difficult to build a chair because I can see all the little pieces that go into making that chair, if that makes sense. They understand the chair and the skill involved in making the chair better, because the chair is a concrete thing. But when we, in our society, and I think this is an issue with how we view art and creative fields, in our society, we actually view people as being talented in creative fields. We think it's all luck. We think they're just blessed with this specific talent to do this specific thing. And every person is predisposed to be good at something, right? Every person is better at some things than others. In some cases, those things were taught to them, and they've developed that skill, so they have a lot more time put into it. Some people are more inclined to be visual, so maybe they're going to be better painters. Some people are more inclined toward music, but at the same time, they put a lot of time into that. It's not just talent. You're maybe 0.00001% of the population is capable of making something amazing. Maybe they have such talent, maybe they are savants in some capacity where they can make art without ever practicing or developing a skill. But almost every single book, actually, I would be very surprised if it wasn't the case that every single book that I've run into is someone who's just developed a skill and kept on writing and plugged away at it, right? So there's two things that go into it when you're approaching something that someone who's creative has made. If you're approaching a piece of art, because everything that falls under art, they put a lot of time into what they've created, and they've also developed a skill, okay? Like I said, with the chair, we can understand that. With art, we can't understand that. So getting back to that first question of yours, how do I create how do I begin a book that's really going to grab my reader? That's the question we're working with as an example. Well, the first question is have you developed the correct skills? Okay? Is your writing competent? And I've said this in the past. You do not have to be the best writer in the world to be successful as a writer. There are tons of writers who are not the best writers in the world, and they have published books, and they have fan bases, and they have tons of people who read their stuff and love their stuff. What they've developed a skill for writing that allows people to understand what they are trying to get across without pain. They can write to the point where people read what they're writing, people understand what has been written, and they do it in a way that doesn't get in the way of what they're understanding. Like I always say, the goal of writing is, when you're writing a novel, especially, actually when you're writing anything, I think this applies to anything, what you want people to do is to forget the writer. You want to disappear into the background. You do not want people to actually be aware that they're reading something. I think that is the ultimate goal of your writing. As I stand right here, right now, all the thought I put into how writing works, the ultimate goal of your writing is for people to be so connected to what you've written that they forget about the fact that they're even reading anything. Now, they do have to have a certain level of skill to actually read, but if they have a general capacity to read, it's not. Most people do. Most people can read well, and most people, if you write well enough, then they're going to be able to read, and they're going to be able to forget that they're actually reading. I think it's a beautiful thing. So the first question to ask when you ask this question is, do you have the capacity to write well enough? Okay, and some people, and I think that the best way to answer that is to give your writing to a few people and just ask them how you're writing. Okay, some people won't like what you're writing. Other people might love it. In the end, what you decide to do is what you decide to do, right? If you decide, hey, I think my writing is good, I'm going to move forward, I'm going to keep on writing. After you hit a certain point, after you hit a certain skill level, the question isn't, how do I write this thing? Because every time you ask, how do I write this thing, the answer is, well, if you want to have the specifics of how you write something, look in a grammar book. Make sure what you are writing fits with grammar. Okay, make sure what you're writing fits with how people actually speak, because grammar is based on language, right? And that is going to answer your question, how do I write this? If you're writing a story, then you might get into learning the art of storytelling, which there is a specific structure that stories fit into, right? There is and I've been learning this is something that has been this is an area where I still need to improve, definitely, and I definitely try to improve every single day. But there is a specific structure. There's been people who talk about this structure. You can actually practice doing this structure in a smaller format, right? You can write short stories and still use the story structure. You can write flash fiction, which is only maybe a paragraph long, and use the story structure and practice that. Okay? You can do that in ways that are smaller. You can even practice writing a story or practice the story structure by outlining. And then you figure out how things are going to flow. And then once you get to the writing portion, you're going to keep on working that out and making that flow the way you want it to. So once you hit that skill level, once you hit the skill level where you're able to write competently, then you move along. If you're writing a story, make sure you can understand the story structure competently. And then after you've gotten to the point of the story structure, we get to this question. How do I create an addictive beginning of a book? That is not the right question you need to ask. The right question is not how I create an addictive opening scene. The question is not how to make something that grabs a person's attention. You already know how to write. Okay, you already have the skill in both the writing and the storytelling capacity. One issue that people have is everybody starts their stories in a similar way. When you read a book, you get informed on how to write just a little bit. Some cases it's more, some cases it's less. When you read a book, you are taking information in that is going to allow you to write better. There are certain books that are very iconic in how they open. For example, Call Me Ishmael in Moby Dick, or It Was the Best of Times, It Was the Worst of Times, etc., from A Tale of Two Cities, or things like It Was a Dark and Stormy Night, which sounds very cliche, but I've never seen It Was a Dark and Stormy Night in the beginning of any other book. I've seen people opening books with storms, but never the actual phrase, It's a Dark and Stormy Night, besides, I can't remember, I don't remember who wrote that, but it actually was the beginning of a story. So the question isn't, how do I do this best? Because with writing, with any creative thing, once you have that skill set, you should not be viewing things as what is the best way to do this, because there isn't one best way. That's my point. When you start a book, there isn't one best way to start a book. There may be 100 good ways to start that book. There may be 1,000. There may be an infinite number of ways to start that book. Instead of thinking, oh, how do I start a book in a way that is really addictive for an audience? Well, I think that one issue we're running into in a lot of storytelling these days, especially in movies, is that people get too focused on this structure of how to tell a story. And they say, oh yeah, these are the ways that people are really going to be grabbed at the beginning of the story. So they pick one of those ways and put it in. That's not creativity. What creativity is I know how to write already. What are different ways I could start this? What creativity is asking yourself what possibilities you have for starting this story. What are the different ways I can start it? Can I start a book with only a single word as a sentence? And the answer is yeah, you can start a book with only a single word as a sentence. Is it going to work? Well, you have to make that assessment. That's part of being creative. Can I start a book where every sentence is the same amount of syllables to have a specific effect? Yeah, you can have a book that has the same amount of syllables in every single sentence of the first paragraph. Can I start a book with dialogue? A lot of people do. Yeah, you can start a book with dialogue. Can I start a book with an onomatopoeia? Yeah, you can start a book with an onomatopoeia. Can I start a book with just a description of a person? Of course. Can I start a book with a description of a place? Yes. Can I start a book with anything? Can I start a book with pretty much anything? Can I start a book with describing how a person drank a glass of water and how the character hated it? Yes, you can start a book in that way too. When you're looking at starting a book, one important factor when you're telling a story is that it's appropriate for the story, right? So it's going to limit what you're able to do. The bigger story you create, the more limited you are. You see this with franchises. So when Star Wars came out, the first Star Wars could have been whatever at all. The first Star Wars film in the 70s, I believe. I'm not that old. In the 70s came out, and it could have been absolutely anything. It could have been a weird sci-fi film. It did not end up being a B sci-fi film. It became a phenomenon, right? And after that, George Lucas and the people creating Star Wars had to follow the same pattern because they had made certain decisions. The more decisions you make in a book, the more limited you are in scope of what you're capable of doing. So, for example, if you have a character and you want to introduce a character in the exact first scene and you want to make it grabbing, and that character is Spock from Star Trek, you probably don't want to have Spock going insane from Star Trek, or you want to keep him within his character, and you want to keep him within what you already know about him or what he's going to be in the story. So certain things, you are limited to a certain degree, but it might be the case that you have an infinite number of possibilities even though you are limited. You just have to think more creatively about them. This is an opportunity for you to say, hey, I know how all the rules work for writing. I know how all the rules work for storytelling. So let's think of different ways we can use those rules. Let's think of different ways that this writing can actually take place. Should I break a rule? Should I not break a rule? Should I turn a convention on its head? Should I not? The door is open. If you want to, you can focus on a single color in your first scene. And if you are doing it right, it's going to grab the reader. The question isn't that the answer is not, hey, this is the specific thing you do for grabbing a reader. The answer is come up with different ideas. Be creative. Do whatever you want. Well, maybe not do absolutely whatever you want, but be creative. Open up your mind to the different possibilities of how something can start. And you are going to probably be creating something that is better than if you took something that worked in the past. I am an advocate of trying things differently, doing things that have not been done before. And in art, that is where we should definitely be doing it. If there's any area in the world, in reality, any sphere where we should be trying things differently and pushing the boundaries, it is art. And if you have a really high level of skill in that artistic field, you are going to be able to push the boundaries further, than other people are capable of pushing them. Okay. Some people think, oh, but that'll limit what I do. There's this lie in our society. There's this lie in our culture that if you do not have rules, you are not free. But if you are someone who is within the bounds of a specific framework, you actually are freer and more capable of doing something. And I think this applies to most areas, but this definitely applies to art. If you know those rules, and I'm still learning them, I'm not perfect. I'm someone who's still developing my skill as a writer. But if you know the rules as a writer, and if you are capable of writing really, really well, think of it this way. There are specific rules that govern sports. There are specific rules that govern figure skating specifically and gymnastics. If you are not good at figure skating or gymnastics, you cannot do much at all. You can do very little. If you are excellent, if you are the best in the world, you can take the rules that govern figure skating and gymnastics, and you can, as long as you can try to do whatever you want. People do quadruple flips. People do those spins. I don't know what they're called. I'm not into figure skating, but it's like that. So we understand things in physical space better, but it still applies to things like art. If you're someone who is extremely skilled in painting, you are going to be able to create things that are extremely engaging and that are bending, that are very creative because you're capable of making it do what you want. Does that make sense? If you're really skilled in an area, you're more capable of making that craft do what you want. You're more skilled at directing it. If you're really skilled in business, you're more capable of building a business well. If you're really, really good at playing an instrument and you're really good at writing music, you're going to be able to stretch that instrument's ability. I don't know what you call it. You're going to be able to take that instrument and you're going to be able to do stuff with it that other people weren't able to do with it. You're able to expand the capacity of that instrument because you're so good at it. You're able to expand the capacity of music because you're just so stinking good at writing music. That's what these old composers did. They expanded what people knew about music. They did different things in music that people weren't doing it. They tried to dredge the depths of what music is and they expanded it by doing it because they were so stinking good. That's the same thing with writing. If you are really, really good at writing, you are going to be capable of writing 25 more. You're going to be capable of writing so many different beginnings of stories that people really love because you don't just take something somebody else has done. You take your skill, you say, hey, for example, I'm going to focus on this one little tiny aspect, or I'm going to take this 5,000 foot view of this thing. I'm going to focus on this person's characteristic, and this person's characteristic is going to govern everything that happens at the beginning of this book. And because you have that skill, you can actually make it happen. I ran into recently someone who was talking about a film director who essentially had 4 characters that he worked with. Okay, he had 4 characters he worked with because he didn't have this great amount of skill with directing. I mean, he was capable of directing and making a competent film, but he was limited by the amount of characters he was able to work with and he was able to write. That's a limitation of his skill. That's a limitation of him understanding the structure of movie making or storytelling, right? That was a limitation of something boxing him in, right? That was because we always think, oh, but if I'm boxed in, I'm not going to be able to do something really well. No, what being boxed into all those rules are, what being really good, understanding all those rules, it doesn't allow. Let me rephrase this. When you approach writing, and when you say, oh, I don't really care about the rules in writing, well, there's certain rules in writing that are actually incorrect. There's certain grammatical rules that don't actually follow language, but you do have to follow language. You do have to make something good. There are certain rules that govern quality. I don't know what all those rules are. There are certain rules that govern quality in writing, in art, in building a chair, etc. And we don't know what all those are, but we understand what good quality is. Those, you are boxed in by good quality. Okay, you are boxed in by the rules of language that create good quality. If you stray from those rules, there's this weird thing in English where if we put specific adjectives in front of another adjective, it's like color, degree, whatever. If you put color, you put color in front of degree. There's specific adjectives we use before other types of modifiers. And if you put those behind that modifier and instead of in front of it, you're actually making the writing worse. Okay? So there are specific things within language that allow you to. What am I trying to say? I'm sorry. There are specific things in language that box you in. That's what I'm trying to say. And there are those things in language are your guideposts. So for example, if you do not care what you do in writing, absolutely, you're like, I can do whatever I want because that's artistic. You're going to come up with bad writing. It's not going to be that artistic because you don't have the skill to actually do it. This is probably the harshest thing I'm actually going to be saying ever. But the reason why is because there are rules to language. We follow language. Writing follows language. It goes back to my rules. The reason why I say writing follows language is because what writers have learned, these really, really good writers have learned that even though the grammar books say one thing, it doesn't necessarily mean good writing in all cases. Okay? So with that, they find that the grammar actually isn't following language to this correctly. That's what they're doing. So yeah, so that is my that is the takeaway this week, I guess. The takeaway this week is that the question isn't how do I do this specific thing? The question isn't how do I do that specific thing? If you're still at the level where you need to learn how to write well, then you can ask, how do I do this specific thing? How do I do that specific thing? How do I create this specific sentence structure? How does this work in the grammar? If your grammar is bad, then learn the grammar. If your storytelling is bad, learn the basic structure of the story. But after you get to that point, you're free. After you get to that point, you get to be creative. And the question is not how do I do this, but what can I do with it? And I've been a little harsh saying you need to learn the skill. You do need to learn the skill. I still need to be better at what I do. I want to be better every single day. But the question is not how. The question is, what can I do? What are the possibilities? That's what you get with art. That is the cool thing about writing. That's the cool thing about any creative field. What can I do with this? Instead of just saying, hey, how do I do this? Because how isn't very fun, because there's going to be a lot of different answers from people, but some people think their way is the only way. And like I said before, there may be, and I would not be surprised at all, an infinite number of ways to start a novel that grab the reader and make them want to read the rest of the book. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support me more, what I would ask you to do is that you go to iTunes and you leave a 5-star review. That is something that really, really helps me and helps push the podcast out to different people. And it's something that doesn't cost you much time at all. So if you would do that, I would really appreciate that. And I definitely appreciate everyone who listens to this podcast. If you ever listen to this podcast and you have questions or you have topics you would like me to cover, you can send those to me and I'll look them over and I'll see which ones I think I can cover intelligently. And if you just want to reach out for anything at all, you can do that as well. Thanks for your time. My name is Daniel Poppy, and as always, this is How to Write Good.